we are exploring the territory of conflict today, not geopolitical, but interpersonal conflict.
Yeah.
And the reason we're doing that is a lot of us feel woefully underprepared in conflict situations, knowing fully well that conflicts are a part of life.
Right. And may I add that I believe that the reason we feel so woefully underprepared is because we don't have the tools. And the reason that we don't have the tools is perhaps because of things that we've absorbed in childhood. If you've seen conflict in your childhood, and who hasn't, right? Uh, Either at home or in the playground, at school, what's your default in childhood? To either lash out or to withdraw into a shell,
Yeah,
right? And that's fight or flight.
right.
What was yours?
Flight. I would be in the workplace doing something, but responding from the place of that 9-year-old whose report card got flung across the room.
Right. And outside of my parents, I would say my conflict style was fight. Perhaps, if I'm to be honest, continues to be.
Yeah. And yet we've been able to pick up a wider range and say I can adopt other styles as required,
Right.
and that's the sensible approach to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're not the children that we used to be. I think what we'd like to do today is to talk about the pillars of conflict as we understand them, to talk about what makes for conflict, what the social constructs are, what the cultural constructs are, what our tools are, and in that sense, to go under the hood and really take a good look at this engine.
Yeah. And leave you in the end with a few parts to explore, and you pick from that what you will. So, we want to start by talking about the cultural context in which conflict happens. And in our case, the Indian socio-cultural context, generational context. So let's talk through that. What do you think are maybe some of the big ones?
Hierarchy, right?
Yeah,
Deferring to authority.
sure.
So, because we've been brought up in largely, um, you know, mm, hierarchical households where one defers to authority, irrespective of experience, may I say, or even expertise, it's hardwired into us, I think, to defer. If someone's older than me, I tend to defer. If someone's more senior than me in the organization, I tend to defer. Despite this little voice in my head that says, you know what, you should speak up. You actually know what you're talking about.
That's right. Yeah. Um, I would also think across generations that's shifting shape, but certainly for us, there was an expectation that you listen to the wise voices of people who've, in both at home and at work, and possibly just a changing shape of the world and the workplace have allowed for a little more equality to permeate. However, I don't think that shows up in the way we deal with disagreements in the house or at work.
Right.
There is in all of us a slightly hardwired system of saying they're senior, they probably know what they're saying. They're elders, they probably know better than I do. Or even if they don't, I don't have the locus right now
That.
to speak up.
Yeah, that, right? That belief that I don't have the locus to speak up. Okay. There's also this need in our cultural context to save face when confronted with trouble. What will the neighbors think?
Yeah, that is so big and so pervasive. So a lot of these, I must hasten to also say, a lot of these beliefs really come from a good place. There is a grain of truth. There's a huge element of truth there, but possibly over leveraged, to use one of your terms.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, do they come from a place of validity? Yes, of course they do. If you lived in a smallish collective like a village of, let's say, 150, 200 people, which is really what we were till a couple of hundred years ago, it made sense that you defer, right? There are the village elders, you defer to them, because what you have if you don't defer is anarchy,
Right.
right? If you can't save face in a certain situation, then what you're faced with is humiliation. And so people actually go out of the way to help you save face, to
Yeah.
give you a bolt hole. And you're considered, I think, ungrateful if you
If you
don't
don't
take
take it.
that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm doing this for your own good. You won't understand it now, you're very young, but outside world will be told this, and we will hide your.
We'll hide your secret,
Yeah.
which might not be that dire a secret.
It'll be. It was in my case really bad grades, right? But I was told to like stay in the house for like a week.
Huh?
So, yeah, yeah. So so stuff like that, and um, so you're right. There's a huge need to save face, and which was relevant at a time when you were villages of 150 people. Now most apartment complexes are thrice that size, and you usually don't know most of your neighbors. So that doesn't function as a collective, right? And therefore, maybe the need to save face and what will people say and Sharma ji ka beta doesn't have that much of a relevance anymore.
Sure. I just think, since you said Sharma ji ka beta, I was thinking that, the number of times you'd have heard that Sharma ji ka beta got into medical college and look at you, you wastrel, look at your grades. And so you save face by buying a seat,
Yeah.
perhaps, that your parents can ill afford.
Yeah.
So save face can have less or more insidious fallouts.
Yeah. Yeah.
This helps to be aware.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other one to my mind is also just being a collectivist society as opposed to being an individual, which means that my individual opinions are quite often sidestepped, right? So we know what is best for you is a good example that the collective family or the collective leadership will tell you what direction your career should go in or whom you should marry or what kind of work you should do or where you should move to. It's just understood that we know what's good for you.
And I think perhaps in sort of the GCC context, this is something the typical Western audience is not going to understand. It also ties back to hierarchy, but there's an added element, I think, in collectivism of doing it for the common good, right? Which is,
Right.
I will subjugate my individual needs for the common good. In that sense, I will contribute to the pot, even if what I get out of the pot is less than what I had brought in.
Right. Mm. Yeah. Well said.
Yeah, thank you.
Also, adding to this already bubbling brew
Yeah, this is quite a mix already.
is intergenerational cycles. Yeah. So I was talking earlier, and I've shared a couple of examples of how my default is to kind of shrink or run away from conflict, and both my brother and I are famously conflict avoidant, and that comes from parents who are also largely conflict avoidant but would have a snake bite temper. And that in turn comes from not having parental figures at an important age of their development and feeling like I don't have power. So I cannot speak up. So it goes back, right? So for me to say in a feedback conversation that, oh, yeah, I should speak up a little bit more is easy. But what I'm trying to do is 3 generations that I know of, and I don't know how far back that goes, of me being told that your voice is not, it's not safe to voice things.
Sure. There's the intergenerational aspect. There's also, I'm sure, the gendered aspect
100%.
of the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And in that sense, I realized that I really like the term snake bite temper, which in my mind means that people can push you and there's no obvious reaction. Push, 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 push. And when the breaking point arrives, there's no real warning sign.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you just lash out.
Yeah.
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 Interesting. So that's, I suppose that's one of the things that happens when we're bad with conflict.
Yeah.
You can't say, hey, listen, there's no warning growl.
There's no warning growl. It takes you to breaking point and you're like, you're literally responding like a cornered animal. And
Right.
yeah. Another one that I'm fond of because it's so funny is being the mediator or the indirect resolution to conflict, where a third person is brought in to be the benign energy who will be like, everybody calm down. I see this a lot in my area of work as well, increasingly now, which is strange, that I'm brought in to mediate conversations. which could really comfortably been had with a little assertiveness. But
On
also
both
on
sides.
both sides. But also on the home front, right? There'll always be like you please come and explain to my foolish child. And then an elderly uncle would come along and be like, what happened, child, right? And
Is this elderly uncle somebody you have respect for?
well, that's not material. Actually, of course, because we all
Huge.
respect our elders.
Yes. Anno Domini carries its own weight.
Its own weight, yeah.
So I have an example actually here, which is since mom's a doctor, uh, I have lost track of the number of times she's told me about a patient who wants their child or grandchild perhaps to be a doctor. The child is resisting really hard. Good for the child. And so they bring the child before my mom, mutinous naturally, and say something on the lines of, Doctor, please talk sense to this child who doesn't want to do medicine, isn't willing to work hard enough. And, my mom's always flabbergasted. And in the last, I don't know, couple of decades, I think the stance she's taken is that if they don't want to do this, let them not. So I don't think that mediator style works in this case.
Yeah.
But it's a great example of shooting the gun off someone else's shoulder, which is not per se a bad thing. There are times when you want to use somebody else's more complementary style to resolve a conflict. But because we're conflict averse, I think it gets overused.
Yeah, it's a strategy, and here you are really abdicating responsibility by saying, you tell.
That's right.
And if that doesn't work, I can always be like, look, she failed. Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to add to like I said, already brewing richness of complications, also generational differences. Gen X, for example, we would very often say yes when we wanted to say no.
Yep. Yeah. So you feel pushed into a corner, and it seems easier in the short term to just accede and not push back. Right?
Yeah. I think the millennials got a little better. I've heard a lot of millennials in workshop and assessment center context saying, we saw our US counterparts pushing back, and so we also started to do that.
Interesting.
So I think there's a little bit of that they picked up, and that translated very well, even on the home front. To go back and say to the parents, for example, that I know you want the child to learn mother tongue, but then I don't see value. And so that might happen, but it'll be like priority 8 or something, right? So examples like that. So to be able to push back on things and say this for me is important, this is not, is something that got better with the millennials.
So is it fair to say that what's alleviated the generational context is actually changing the cultural context?
Yes.
Well,
very nicely done. Yes.
oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Right. And then we have Gen Z, where I think there's a lot more ability to push back, but I suppose the complaint I hear most often is about the classic deadpan face. Having said which, I believe that the ability to push back and say no is a great ability when combined with a why and a counteroffer. Right? I can't do this in the shape and time that you want it done in. Here's what I can do for you instead. And I think for me, the example that always sticks out is my daughter, Anisha, many years ago. She's working now. But many years ago, I think just leading up to her 10th standard boards, and she was always a very good student, there was a sort of hope, I won't call it an expectation, that she does medicine and as a sort of poor fallback, perhaps engineering, right? Because there are a couple of doctors in the family. Now, here's what happened. She was very clear that's not the path she wanted to go down. And she was able to hold that line despite, a fair amount of pressure. The pressure, I hasten to add again, wasn't from the parents. Right? Now, I also think that what made that safer for her, and maybe we can generalize this as a truth. Maybe knowing that someone's got your back when you push back is what makes all the difference.
Yeah. And that sort of bakes into our situation the need for safety in dealing with conflict. And we'll keep coming back to that theme through the conversation. But that's an excellent introduction to the idea that, when you feel safe, you can
Push back.
You can push back. Yeah.
I think that takes us quite naturally to our conflict responses. And these are reasonably universal. Would you like to lead out?
Sure. We spoke about fight and flight earlier. I'm going to add a couple, freeze and fawn. Yeah, and these are creature level responses that all animals do, and humans as animals have the same responses, and they're all unconscious responses.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's not dictated by the prefrontal cortex of our brain, which, you know, firstly is the last to develop, the last part of our brain to develop. Also takes the longest to respond.
To warm up, yeah.
Right? So if you're faced with a stress situation, you always feel the fear or the anger or both, and then the fight or flight way before you're able to process a thought around what's going on.
Yeah.
And I think just understanding that that's how the brain works is itself hugely beneficial to conflict.
Right. You have a description for what's going on with you, and that gives you the starting point too. So that's you building safety for yourself. Yeah.
Verbiage makes such a difference, right? If you don't know that
You name it.
yeah, you name it and you're empowering yourself.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Let's look at a couple of examples, yeah, and see if you can add to some of the examples of fight, possibly flight.
I don't know if anyone noticed, but the moment Monica said fight, she pointed quite naturally at me. And I have a feeling I should be offended, but
Let's fight about this.
lightsabers.
Lightsabers indeed. So,
But okay, you were talking about fight, and you said, do you have a couple of examples of?
Anna was saying all of these, we'll look at examples.
So, okay, fight. So what is the fight response? I'm faced with a stressful situation, and my instinct is to push myself forward, which means that the other person has to retreat. Now, I have so many examples of this from my work life, but I'll choose one. Now, there's one boss I mentioned before, very fond of him, Kanchan Pant. We had a great working relationship. We had a lot of things in common as well. But I always remember that, so there was this one time and I was heading retail and sales, when he came to me and said, this October, November, December quarter, we need a 300% growth vis-a-vis last year. And my instinct, I remember, my unthinking response was to get up, and this was a meeting of all heads of department, was to get up in this relatively small group of 6 or 8 people and say, Pant, that's impossible. I mean, what do you expect me to do? Pull a rabbit out of a hat? And I remember, in addition to the words, I also remember that I'm fairly sure my voice rose. I think it shook. I could feel the heat in my face, and that's fight. I feel, and when I sort of unravel the fibers there, I'm fighting because I feel threatened. So, my other response might have been flight, except that I would feel that if I don't take control of the situation now, I'll be taken advantage of. My neck's on the line. So my default very often tends to be fight, not flight. And I think how we think about that is, what's the size of the threat that's facing you is usually what determines fight or flight. Perceived size of threat.
Yeah. And a couple of things that I picked up on from what you said, right? There is a presenting emotion, which is to fight, which is to push back. There is a physical emotion response, which is, blood to the face and so on. And there is a non-presenting underlying set of emotions, which is fear, feeling threatened, feeling like if I don't speak up now, I will be taken advantage of, right? So that's what's driving this engine. So there are two things happening. One's on the surface and one is something that we can't see. And let's unpack the same for the others. Yeah, I'm going to go slightly reverse and start with Fawn, and this is to demonstrate that the same person can have more than, I mean, we all have range, but we also have go-tos. I remember fawning, which is overly apologizing, saying, no, I'll get it done, please don't worry, etc. I was in the office at 8 p.m. very early in my career. One of the senior leaders walked past and saw me and was like, hey, what happened to that newsletter that you released last month? It's a monthly, right? And it's been a month, yes? And he just asked And he clarified that he asked because he missed reading the next one and he was excited about it. I went into overdrive. I worked overnight in the office, got it ready the next day, and then said, okay, here it is. None of which was required, but it was a Fawn response coming from a place of, if I don't do this, I'm not safe in this organization. Nobody said anything of the sort. It was a threat only in my head.
Would it be fair to say that fawning is overly deferring to authority?
That's right. Yeah. And it's also something that you tend to do more of early in your career when you're unsure of your ground or in a new job. Yeah.
I have a metaphor for that. Not everyone's going to like this one. But fawning is a little bit like, the response. Fawning is a little bit like this. You find a puppy on the road that seems abandoned, and the puppy is inclined to be friendly, but is also scared. So what does it do? Right, it runs in circles around you. It wags its tail. It pushes up against you, and it hopes that you give it some food. So there's as much. I think there's some fear there.
That's right.
Coupled, I think, with this idea that if I fawn enough, I will not be harmed.
Right. Yeah.
So the size of the threat is bigger. For whatever reason, doesn't make you run away, but you do kowtow.
You do kowtow. I think if the threat is benign and looks friendly enough, but it's a big, powerful figure of authority that's twinkling at you, you'll be like, I'll fawn. Right? Nice. At the same time, I've also frozen when there was a leadership change, and again, a couple of years after the earlier incident, I had probably the most social capital of anybody in my team, and I could have really used it. Multiple people said you need to,
capitalize.
You need to capitalize. You need to jostle for space, right? I did nothing. I just froze, thinking so much movement is happening, such a stampede over here. If I don't move, I don't have any danger. And that's exactly what happened. I stayed exactly where I was. A bunch of people shifted. A bunch of people got ahead of me, right? And I went nowhere because of the freeze.
So would it be fair to paraphrase freeze as, if I stay deer in the headlights?
Deer in the headlights.
If I stay absolutely still, perhaps a predator will move away because it doesn't see me. And this again is in certain situations, especially where you have genuine threat to life, man-eating predator on the loose, is a perfectly valid response. And I think what I'm left with is this idea that all these responses made sense at a particular point in time.
Right.
Right? When we lived much closer to nature, which exists for millions of years. And what's happening now is that we aren't able to separate an annoyed boss from a man-eating
tiger.
Yeah. In our heads, it's the same stress response.
Yeah.
It's the same spike of adrenaline and cortisol.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah. So those are responses that we make, and freeze and flight. Right. And flight again. Another 3-4 years have passed. I work in a different organization. I dealt with angry, loudly yelling leaders for a little bit, and I said, I can't do this, and I ran for it. Right? And that's an example of not staying back and holding your ground and saying, I'm sorry, can you please talk to me with respect? Or at least lower your voice, which was well within my rights to do. It didn't strike me as an option at that time. Right? Again, all of these fairly early in my career, not yet 30, I'm going to say. So, right? So those are responses that we're all making almost at actually at a creature, at an animal level, right? And like you said earlier on, just talking about it and giving it a name then gives us clarity to say, okay, what now?
What now?
Right? And that takes us to what now, which is conflict styles.
We were just talking about how all of us have these default responses, right? Which takes us to this whole idea of conflict styles. Now, the construct that we have around this is, again, a 2-axis model. On the one axis, on the x-axis, you have cooperation, moving from low to high. We'll put up a visual. Right. On the other axis, we have assertiveness, again moving from low to high. So the junction of the two axes is low assertiveness and low cooperation, which is the box of avoiding. So you avoid conflict where possible, right? Low assertiveness or low ability to stand up for myself and low cooperation is avoidance. So that's the axis, that's the quadrant of avoiding. And we thought what we do this time is perhaps give you movie examples, and if we can think of personal examples, we'll do that as well.
Sure.
Avoid.
So avoiding Devil Wears Prada, the first movie, the role that Anne Hathaway plays, right, Andrea, she avoids conflict with the boss for as long as possible. And interestingly, when the boss throws it on her face right at the end that a million girls would kill for this job or something, she realizes just how how long she's then avoiding dealing with the conflict in her own head and the conflict externally and exits, right? But that's avoidance for you. Um, Something is happening, you look away, you look away, you look away, and you're really hoping your inner voice is really saying, if I look away long enough, maybe it'll go away.
Yeah. Or perhaps the stakes are not high enough. So I would absolutely use
Very nice.
avoidance where the outcome doesn't matter enough to me, right? The person's sufficiently unpleasant or the situation sufficiently unpleasant, and the outcome doesn't matter quite as much to me, so I can sidestep and
Right.
just let it go. And sometimes that's the best thing for my peace of mind. I think with all of these styles, they can either work for you or against you.
Right. They in themselves contain range, and therefore you decide which one do I pick depending on the situation, how much gas I have available in the tank, how much this matters to me. They keep saying pick your fights. So is this a fight I want to pick?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's a moral judgment attached to being or using any of these styles. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. The next quadrant we should talk about, I think, is the quadrant of accommodation, which is I'm high on cooperation, I'm low on assertiveness. My ability to stand up for myself is low. And therefore, I accommodate. As opposed to avoiding, which is what we spoke about earlier, here I would take the other person's views, opinions, needs as more important than mine and make space for them. So, in that sense, I'm backing my car out of my own garage to make space for my neighbors, as it were. That's accommodating.
If I could again give a couple of examples here,
Oh, yeah.
and because you said there's range even within accommodation, one example again, Devil Wears Prada, the other character Emily, who's constantly accommodating needs of others. And on the other end of the spectrum, possibly the movie Intern, where Robert De Niro plays the intern at over 60 years old, accommodating, but a very powerful sort of accommodation coming from a position of knowing your own expertise. I will let this go, or I will allow you to do this because I know the value that I bring to the table. Right. So, good examples of early in your career and very late in your career, and what a difference the same style makes.
Right. So, what that really means in my head is you can, at a strategic level, you can say, I can let this go because there's a greater good that I can get from it. At an unthinking level, one might be accommodating because one isn't able to stand up for oneself.
Well said. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
The next one to talk about is going up high on the other axis. Now, going up high on the assertiveness axis, low on the cooperation axis. So, high assertiveness, low cooperation, and that gives us the quadrant of competing. This is where it really becomes a zero sum game, right? For me to win, you have to lose.
Yeah.
And again, there are times when this is the right thing to do. So, for example, I think I would play in the competing quadrant if I believed A, that I had a high chance of success, and B, if my gains, my potential gains outweighed my losses.
Right.
So, it can be a strategic call, and it should be. It can also be unthinking, which is that I compete regardless of the stakes, regardless of my chance of success, because that's how I've been. That's my unthinking response.
Right.
I knew you have an example because by now I'm very sure you do.
Actually, I have an example of that unthinking response that you talked about, which is Succession, the entire series. It's very annoying to watch it a little. But all the Roys are constantly competing mindlessly with each other, right? So,
What's a Roy?
and allowing outsiders to come in and take over because the unit doesn't hold.
I think that's actually a great example of what happens when it's unthinking competition, right? In Kannada, and I'm going to say this, in Kannada. In Kannada, there's a gade, which is a folk saying, that ibbara jagala ಮೂರನೆಯವನ ಲಾಭ. The quarrel, two people's quarrel, is to the benefit of the third person who's an outsider.
Yeah.
And I think that's...
Yeah, that's pretty much this. Yeah.
Okay, good place to leave competing in. Finally, we have what I consider the last of the main quadrants. So the last of the four big ones, but not the actual last. We'll talk about that and why that is so. Which is, it's high on both assertiveness and cooperation. And that's the quadrant of collaboration, where I bring something to the table, you bring something to the table, and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That's really a good time to be collaborating. Now, some people are more aligned towards collaboration than others. When would I use collaboration if I was able to think about it, right? It would be when it's exactly what I just said, right? Which is both of us gain more by bringing our forces together. That's collaboration, which also means that you must have time, you must have some amount of mutual goodwill, and otherwise collaboration isn't going to work.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of collab?
Loads, and a lot of movie arcs are about people learning to collaborate. Apollo 13, Hidden Figures. I don't know why we always have to go to space to collaborate. There's a lot of opportunity to do that on planet Earth as well. But yeah, so yeah, plenty of examples of good collaboration. Yeah.
I have an example of collaboration, which is if you watch a good game of football, soccer for our Western cousins, you might have somebody who is an incredibly gifted striker, but who knows he or she doesn't have a good shot at the goal. Now, they know that their stats go up if they happen to, or if they're able to score a goal. Chances are low. What do? They pass to a teammate who's better placed to score. And so what happens is the team gains. These people's stats don't go up, but you do have an overall victory.
Right.
So that's collaboration, where there's enough mutual goodwill, there's enough sense of what's good for the overall entity, and therefore you do what's not necessarily in your immediate individual interest, but it does lead to a blossoming of the good of the enterprise.
Right. So the rising tide that lifts all boats.
That's right. Oh, how nice. So I did say that this is the last of the four main quadrants. That's true. There is, however, an in-between space between collaboration and competing, which is compromise. Right? Which is, I don't have, let's say, for example, I don't have the time, space, energy to actually collaborate with this person. It's not in my interest or their interest, perhaps even, if I were to compete. And there's a lot to lose, but perhaps we can gain almost as much as we would individually if we were to compromise and arrive at a place where both of us aren't completely satisfied with the outcome, but both of us aren't completely dissatisfied either. One way I think about it is that if we compromise and both of us believe that the other person got the better of the deal, it's probably a good compromise.
Right.
I have an example.
Yeah. You have an example?
I have an example. And this is from my early work life. I was based out of Mumbai for me. And the company I was with was putting a tender with the Airports Authority of India for coffee and tea vending machines. So were two other companies, right? And all three, so between the three of us, we were the triumvirate that sort of formed the apex of the coffee, tea, beverage part of the market. Now, here's what happened. We went before the Airports Authority of India multiple times, sealed tenders, they're trying to push everybody, beat everyone's prices down, which is what they're supposed to do. Now, at some point, I think after this has been going on for maybe a quarter, the three of us decided to meet outside of this construct. So I think we just went and had a cup of tea somewhere at some Irani cafe. And the oldest of us, I still remember, said, listen, at this rate, all of us are going to land a deal that's unprofitable, which is kind of pointless, right? It's like saying, I will, I win the war, but mm, I have nothing left in the coffers to enjoy my,
Peacetime.
yeah, exactly. So what he actually suggested was that we compare rates and see if you could divide the pie among us, because we also knew the size of the pie, and the pie wasn't growing very much. This is actually something that I remember reading about, whatever, 3 decades ago, a concept called cooperation, but it's also compromise, which is that by doing this, and here's the funny thing, right? We did each of us get roughly 1/3 of the pie. AAI knew largely what we'd done. They weren't very thrilled, but it was all right because because we all tended at roughly the same price, it wasn't a zero-sum game where one person gained and another person lost. And the person who won perhaps said, I'm doing this, but I'm losing money with every cup I sell. So hopefully that makes sense.
Absolutely. Very nicely explained. Yeah. Yeah. Really, really clear on that. Yeah.
Excellent.
So, the only final question that I have on this for us to explore is, how do we sort of pick up the range to go across each of these? One, you said is situational. You're right. And possibly looking at what is the power equation in this situation. Can I afford to be competing? Can I afford to be avoiding or accommodating, and so on, right? What else do you think contributes to somebody picking up range to go from one style to the other?
Knowledge.
Mm,
As you said in a different context, if I know, if I have the vocabulary to articulate this, then I also know that I have style, I have fluency, I have the ability to move across styles. If I know, for example, speaking for myself, that my styles tend to move between fundamentally collaborating and accommodating, which is, I think these, when I first checked, these were my two dominant styles. Just knowing that it's all right for me to avoid a conflict because, the game isn't worth the candle, just was so empowering.
right.
And then, you come up with on a situation and you're, with practice, able to layer that onto this theoretical concept and say, oh, you know what, this is where I am. This is where it makes sense to be. Can I move across? Like with most things, it takes practice. There's one thing I'd like to add, though, which is the value of, so I think we over-index on things like memory and willpower. There's also, I think, the value of, if you work in teams, finding somebody in your team whose conflict style is better suited to the situation that you're in. Right?
Complementary.
It's complementary. And using them with their full knowledge. So if I have somebody whose style is fundamentally, let's say, accommodating, in a situation where I or my team gains from being accommodating, let's say something like a government tender, for example, right? I would leave my ego at the door and say, hey, you know what, Sham, your style works well in this context. How would you feel about front-ending this discussion?
Yeah.
And it really requires you to be very unambiguous about the fact that this is a strategic call and you can leave your ego at the door.
Nice.
It requires grown-upness.
So here's why it's to be a grown up. Yeah. Yeah, wonderful. I was also thinking of in the kind of work that I do now, because a lot of, what I've been talking about up until now is really early career examples. But in the kind of work I do now, which is advisory work, I'm really seeing the value of switching across these, right? My role requires me to go into a situation where something is brewing, there's a problem. That's why I've been brought in. I need to really swiftly build trust with the people who run that business and who have a lot to lose if the problem isn't solved. And, maybe like a week to do all of that trust building in and then jump in. Right. So if I'm able to demonstrate accommodating their needs, while also saying I disagree with you on something and really going back and forth between those. And then saying, okay, now let's bring everybody together and let's figure out, bring all your stakeholders for the table, let's sort this out, let's move towards collaboration, right? And I'm kind of seeding the word, I'm seeding the behavior, I'm seeding the sort of rituals needed for that to happen. And that's the work, right? And so to say that I'm sitting in the middle of conflict and it's multi-directional, multi-part, and to say I need to demonstrate this range to these folks for me to succeed and obviously for them to succeed is super empowering and a huge shift from saying, you know what, I don't know how to fight, I'm very scared. I continue to be that person in many, many situations, right? But I think tactically to be able to do that, and before you know, you start to shift and you become more and more, it's really fake it till you make it.
Yeah, excellent example. What I picked up on there was the iterative nature of this.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So you pick up on whatever your style is. Let's say your style is fundamentally accommodating for good reasons, and you iterate on that until you're able to move both parties concerned to collaboration.
Right.
Because you don't start with collaboration also requires high trust on both sides, right? Which isn't something that you get out of the gate. This construct that we've been talking about is something called the Thomas Kilmann inventory, the TKI, right? It's a tool which you can take to figure out what your conflict style is.
Absolutely.
Now,
Takes
just for
10
a
minutes.
reference, it takes
Yeah.
10 minutes
Yeah.
and gives you a real sense of which quadrant you fundamentally fall in and what your sort of, what your default is and what your shadow style is.
Right.
Sorry, I interrupted you, I know, but I was just on the verge of giving credit. And
Yeah. Yeah. And you said it's iterative and it's absolutely true. I remember a few years ago, my dominant style was accommodating. Now it's collaborating. So it changes,
it does
right?
change.
It changes. It's like going to the gym. Whatever I work out on is the muscle group that gets stronger.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So here's where we are. We've spoken about the cultural context of conflict. We've spoken about how the generational milieu influences conflict. We've spoken about our fight, flight, fawn, freeze responses to conflict, and how that leads to our dominant and shadow styles when it comes to conflict, right? Which is to avoid, accommodate, compete, collaborate, or compromise. And it makes sense now to move to, I suppose, what can we do to repair? What can we do to do better? I very cheekily thought of an acronym, which I'm going to trademark, and that is C4, co-creating conditions for what?
Constructive
Constructive conflict.
conflict.
Thank you. C4.
C4.
So proud of you. Applause. I'd like to hear, I'd like to talk about what is it that makes conflict constructive rather than destructive?
We spoke about safety. So, what contributes to safety is a good lens to apply to this whole thing. And let's start with the bare basics, which so often is not easy to accomplish, which is not is being non-violent in your communication. So verbal violence gets in the way of it being a good conversation because immediately the other person's hackles rise, and then where's the scope after that to have a calm conversation if one person has entered the arena shouting?
Right. So, verbal calm. And it's odd, right? Because if you've taken the trouble to be verbally calm, then it usually translates to your body language as well.
Yeah. And I think it goes both ways. I could be the one starting the conversation, and if I can be calmer about it and not start with a raised voice, as well as somebody else starts with a raised voice. But if I refuse to respond with a raised voice and I keep my calm, and it's just the equivalent of lobbing it back over the net, that's all I'm doing, right? The other person will at some point have
In
to
time.
in time.
In time.
Yeah.
It often takes longer than you think, but
Right.
it does usually
Yeah.
come down with time.
Yeah.
Excellent. I can't remember the name of the book, but there's this great illustration I saw, which I think also helps with how to think about conflict, which is unfruitful conflict is you versus me,
Mm.
right? And the problem's actually watching from the sidelines, like a bad tennis match, and jeering.
Not the problem is, but the problem itself is watching from the
Yes.
sidelines. Yes.
And good conflict is where it is you and me versus the problem. And I know there's a visual for this. We should find
We'll
it.
find and put it in there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And the other one I have, and this is something that's that you demonstrate to, and it's one of your favorites, which is silence, which is to allow for. I'm not saying silent treatment,
Thanks.
right?
I was just one.
Yeah. No. Allow for silences in the conversation, right? And that opportunity to reset, that's opportunity to think, that's opportunity for the parasympathetic nervous system to subside and for my prefrontal cortex to engage again and say, oh, wait, this person hasn't attacked me yet. Maybe I have the space to speak.
Right. Because one does tend to push back harder. Pushback elicits pushback. Is it fair to say that silence also leads to you listening willy-nilly? Right? And listening, if one person feels that they've not been listened to, is usually a great breeding ground for conflict.
Yeah.
It's like a petri dish for conflict.
Yeah.
And William Urey, who I know I've spoken to you about before, right? This amazing negotiator worked for the US government many decades ago, co-founding the Harvard School of Negotiation, said that in a negotiation, and in some ways conflict is a negotiation, in a negotiation, listening is the cheapest concession that you can make. It's free. And I have found time and time again that when you can actually lower your hackles and listen to the other person, they will often meet you closer to where you are.
Right.
It's very counterintuitive.
Right.
Conflict situation, listening is the most counterintuitive thing you can do.
You can do.
But also perhaps the most valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's lovely. Yeah.
What else do you have?
So often in an argument, in this one is more, I think, outside of the workplace, although I think also in the workplace, because I don't think we're two different people to a degree where we can fight differently at work. But there's a lot of you didn't do this.
I'm going to disagree there and say I've seen people be two very different people at work and at home.
Sure.
But that usually creates a bit of a fracture in the personality. So, assuming you're the same person.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No worries. Right. There's a lot of you didn't do this or action. Yeah. If instead of that, I end up saying, I experienced blah, 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 and you're really owning your experience. You're not saying you're the guilty party you're the culprit for doing all of this. You're just saying your actions elicited this response in me, right? And so I'm just saying this is, if I say that to somebody in a conflict situation, they're going to say, you can't feel that way, right? So I'm really just talking about my own experience and I have ownership of that, right? While if I'm calling somebody, you're a moron for doing this, then that's the end of the conversation before it starts.
I feel versus you are.
Yeah.
Right? Excellent. Okay. What about hot buttons? Because, especially two people who know each other well, whether at work or at home,
Yeah.
after a while, you really know what to say to aggravate the other person. And that's clearly not leading to any good kind of conflict.
No. I unfortunately don't remember where I read this, right? But I read it and it just sparked so much for me that, and I'll talk about what that is, which is instead of attacking the hot button, right? So somebody's confided in me in a moment of vulnerability that, because this is how I've been from the time I was a child. If somebody makes fun of, say, my appearance, then I really shut down. To then attack their appearance in an argument with them is attacking hot buttons, right? And instead to protect their vulnerability in a fight, right? So I'm in a conflict situation with them, and instead of saying, when your parents told you your blah blah, they were right, to never go to that place, to protect the space I know they're tender in and say, I will not go there. I'll fight around it. Yeah. And that then means that the person knows they are not in danger from me. Right? That they can be from danger from just about anybody in the world, but I'm not going to go there, despite having knowledge of their frailties, is super powerful in a. And then, like you said, this is truer for longer ranging relationships, old friendships, siblings,
True.
Especially with siblings, right? You really know all of their hot buttons from the time they were like 2. And you're like, I will show you.
You remember that one time when um,
Come up with the worst example.
you went home with the vegetable vendor, for example. You still do that. You trust the wrong people. Wait, did your brother do it? I mean, we are in danger of apoplexy with this.
No, he just left his school bag in the bus.
Oh, that's. I'm sure every kid's done that.
Exactly. You don't know that, right? And you're like, he did that, and 50 people like me too. And you're like, okay.
Yeah, probably not you. Very goody two shoes.
Yes, unfortunately.
Okay. Moving on from personal attacks.
Right.
Um.
I have one more,
Oh.
which is apology.
Again, very counterintuitive. Not easy to do in the heat of the moment.
No. And there's a whole science to apology, and we'll put this up, this framework of Harriet Lerner's, and there's many, but this is one that I use a lot, and therefore I'm familiar with it. And it talks about all the things that we end up doing in an apology that we shouldn't. I'm sorry if I hurt you. I'm sorry this is going to sound mean, but I'm sorry however you started it. Yeah, so there's so many conditions to that I'm sorry that
Are you
it
saying that
renders
an
the.
apology should be unconditional?
No,
Huh.
no.
Oh.
But it shouldn't have these. I'm sorry that an event happened. I recognize my contribution in that event. I'll try and not do it again, right? Because the best apology is really when I stop doing the same thing
Right.
and, keep doing the same thing over and over again over 10 years and keep apologizing. The apology loses power,
Right.
right? So committing to change how I've done this the next time I'm in the same situation is powerful. Also, not to say now that I've said I'm sorry, we are back to being great friends and you better be nice to me and let's go for chat is unfair, right? So a demand of forgiveness is not a good apology.
Right.
And to also, if it's a big enough problem, right, to also acknowledge that maybe my apology is not going to stop this person from wanting to not be my friend or to take a couple of steps back and to sit in the helplessness of that situation.
Right. Sure. So, I suppose if I were to loosely paraphrase, what you're saying is that conflict is difficult, so is its resolution. And sometimes you just need to sit in discomfort and not expect that all the the loose ends will be neatly knotted up.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think it might be a good time for us to just introduce the whole idea of conflict as a continuum. So Patrick Lencioni actually spoke about this, and the way to think about it is that you have no conflict on the one side and very high conflict on the other side. Now, what low conflict or no conflict actually is it's artificial harmony. It's not really harmony, it's artificial harmony. Nobody's speaking up because they don't want to rock the boat. But as a consequence, you're not growing either as a person or as an organization. So that's the really, the unfortunate side of no conflict. And over on the other side of the continuum, high conflict, nothing gets done because I'm constantly hunkering down in a foxhole and pulling my helmet down over my head, as it were. And so you need to find a middle ground. And the way that is described is that you have a sort of sweet spot of conflict, which is as far as the conflict is intellectual. And you can disagree intellectually, it's healthy conflict.
Right.
There's an inflection point where it moves over into interpersonal conflict, into abuse. How do you know? The truth is, before it happens, you often don't. So you need to, sort of tentatively approach that inflection point and sometimes put a foot over it and say, oops, a step too far, and come back.
Right.
But if you think about it, without intellectual conflict, where would you be?
Correct.
That example of this lady who figured out that a large number of infantile deaths. Do you know this example?
The research.
The researcher, right, who figured out, I think in 1960s England, a large number of infantile deaths were because of prenatal X-rays. Now, how did she figure this out? Right, so she initially started by looking at, is it to do with socioeconomic standing, with diet? Turned out it's none of these things. So she decided to research this in depth, and she theorized that this was because of X-rays. Now, here's where the conflict part comes in. Her partner in her research was a statistician, and his job was to question her methods. In a word, to keep her honest. And I think they collaborated for something like 20 years.
Wow.
Right? Which means you know how to disagree, and you know how to disagree while keeping the relationship alive and flourishing.
Right. So I'm taking away a couple of things from here. One is you create that space, in this case, in the form of a role. So part of the charter is to find ways in which you disagree with me, with data, with gentleness. And so I realize what's happening and I'm not threatened by it.
Yep.
Right. And the other is what you said earlier about stepping over that boundary. You do it gently enough. If I'm crossing over that boundary and I'm pretty much running the 100-meter dash over it, I don't have space to retract and then,
Yeah, so it's a little tentative. You're feeling for that line.
very carefully. So I'm not like, ham-fisted over it.
Absolutely.
I'm
What can you do if you actually cross that line? I'm a great believer in the value of, um, just taking a breather.
Yeah.
And say, you know what, I think I might have gone too far.
Yeah.
Can I have a couple of minutes to reconsider?
Yeah. And yes, and people are so willing to accommodate that. I'm actually thinking of examples from Obvious where there was a lot of intellectual back and forth, right, friction or disagreement, because that's the nature of work. For you to make a really high quality product, it has to go through multiple. This isn't okay, or we need to do this differently. Right?
Strong disagreements, strong personalities.
All of that, right? And what held the core of it together was that the people with most power would be careful about when somebody is so very, very sensitive to changes of mood in the room, right? I remember one of them at some point said something and then he looked around and said, "What happened?" Right? And then immediately everybody's like, "Oh, this is not something to be scared of." And then he said, "Okay, let's all take a couple of minutes, play back to me what you thought I said," which I thought was so beautiful.
Very nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have another sort of analogy, I suppose, for this, which is, what happens when you have no friction? And if I take the analogy of a car sitting on the road and there's no friction between the tires and the tarmac, the car is just going to spin in place in perpetuity. What happens if you have, and so there's no movement forward. What happens if you have extremely high friction?
Yeah.
The tires and the car are going to burn. So you need just the right amount of friction to move forward.
Yeah.
Very proud of that one.
That's lovely. Yeah. And that's what good engaging with conflict does for us. It's just the right amount of, the Goldilocks amount of friction to um, have a layered life.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
In conclusion, for me, I'm going to say that, like Monica said earlier, conflict can be deeply productive. It's all about finding that Goldilocks zone. Monica?
You can start at a certain place and engage with both internal and interpersonal conflict and get to a different place because you've put in a lot of elbow grease and you find yourself happier, richer for it.